Chapter 26, Discovery in the Lab, Part 2. The hum of Brumkorath's high-tech research lab filled the air with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Lucas stood alone in the heart of the facility, surrounded by equipment far beyond the kind of technology he had encountered before. Walls of sleek, reflective metal stretched high into the ceiling, displaying flickering monitors filled with arcane data, holographic charts, and strange blueprints that seemed to dance before his eyes. He hadn't expected to be here, not after everything that had happened. But the dwarves had granted him access to their most advanced research resources, a concession they had made reluctantly yet firmly, considering his connection to the relics. The relics that had been wrapped around his wrist and the others since the night in the ruins, relics that seemed far more than simple artifacts. He was alone, save for the machines that hummed and clicked in the background, tirelessly scanning and processing data. The air smelled faintly of sterilized metal, a scent that reminded him of the clinical precision of a place like this, a place where knowledge could be both a weapon and a salvation. As he approached the central table, he gently laid the relic down. It was attached to his wrist, of course. He had never managed to remove it, and as far as he knew, neither had Thomas nor Mina. The dark stone glimmered with an unnatural light, as though it had a pulse of its own, a beat that Lucas could sense deep in his bones. He had long ago stopped asking why they couldn't take them off. The relics were part of them now, fused with their skin, attached to their lives in ways that went beyond physical explanation. There had been moments when Lucas wondered if they were somehow locked in a silent agreement with the relics. The bonds too strong to break, no matter how hard they tried. The relic on the table was inactive now, its surface smooth and still. But Lucas knew better than to trust appearances. It had been dormant since they had first encountered it, but he sensed the potential for something far greater. He could feel the strange, almost subtle hum beneath his skin whenever he touched the relic, and in these moments, he swore that the sensation was almost alive. It was as though the relics were waiting, biding their time until something unlocked them. He leaned forward, connecting his mind to the relic once more, his telepathic focus shifting toward it. The connection was subtle, barely perceptible at first, a flicker of energy that surged through his body. His mind reached out tentatively, trying to probe into the artifact, but it was like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands, elusive, shifting, and just out of reach. Lucas narrowed his eyes and closed his fingers around the relic. His telepathic abilities, though still developing, had become more attuned with each passing day. He focused, trying to dive deeper into the relic's essence. He expected to encounter the familiar hum of thought patterns, something that might resemble a consciousness, even a faint one. What he found instead sent a ripple of discomfort through his mind. There was no clear intelligence within the relic, not in the way he had hoped. Instead, there was a dense, impenetrable web, a network of strange signals that almost resembled the firing of neurons, like a brain, but far more alien. The feeling was disorienting. His connection to the relic seemed more like a tangled mess of static, as if the relic was a collection of dormant thoughts that had been woven into the stone. The neurons fired sporadically, like tiny sparks of energy, but there was no order to them, no central figure guiding them. Just chaos, as if something ancient and incomprehensible was attempting to awaken, but could not. Lucas pulled back slightly, taking a breath to steady his nerves. He tried again, more focused this time. The network felt like a neural web, not unlike his own mind, but vastly different in its complexity. There were flickers of something deeper in the stone. Memories, perhaps. Memories that were not his own. They were distant and fragmented, like echoes of a long-forgotten civilization. Faint images of cities beyond time, ancient creatures, and towering constructs flashed in his mind's eye. Yet each time he tried to approach them, they receded into the depths of the stone, slipping away like shadows at dusk. The relic was dormant. That much was clear. But Lucas felt an undeniable pull from it, as though it were calling to him, waiting for something to trigger its awakening. There was an energy there, buried deep within the neural network of the relic, something that recognized his touch, his presence. But it was locked away, hidden behind layers of protective mechanisms he could barely begin to understand. He pulled his hand back with a jolt, feeling a sharp pulse of discomfort run through his arm. It was a warning, or so he thought. As if the relic were telling him, not yet. But the sensation lingered, gnawing at him with the unsettling knowledge that he was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. Lucas wiped his brow, pushing aside his fear, trying to make sense of what he had felt. There was something he couldn't ignore about the relics. They were connected to something much older than he had ever imagined. Their origins were not of this world, or at least not of any world he knew. Perhaps they were linked to the Sent Ones, artifacts that could bring about great change. Or perhaps they were something darker, something that had lain dormant for centuries, awaiting the right moment to resurface. He stepped away from the table, his eyes flickering toward the other relic on his wrist. He had always tried to ignore the feeling it gave him, as though it was simply an object, a tool in his possession. But now, in the sterile environment of the research lab, surrounded by technology far beyond his understanding, he began to realize that the relics were more than tools. They were part of him, just as they were part of Thomas and Mina. They were inextricably tied to their fates. And yet, there was still so much that remained unknown. Lucas turned his gaze back to the flickering screens around him, searching for answers in the digital data that sprawled across the displays. Numbers, symbols, equations. Nothing that made sense. The technology seemed to be beyond any explanation he could come up with. It was as if the relics themselves were wrapped in a web of hidden code, waiting for someone to decipher it. He wondered if he, or perhaps even the party as a whole, was meant to be the key. His fingers brushed the surface of the relic again, and for a brief moment he felt the strange pulse once more. This time, though, the feeling was more insistent, stronger. The relic was reacting to him, or perhaps to his emotions. There was something about the way it resonated with him that hinted at its potential power. And for the first time, Lucas felt a deep, visceral connection to the relic. A connection that left him questioning not just what the relics could do, but what they were. The unease that crept up his spine was not fear, but a sharp awareness of the responsibility that had come with the relics. He could sense their potential, but it was a potential that came with no guide, no manual, only the cryptic whispers of an alien intelligence and the promise of something greater, and perhaps far more dangerous, waiting just beneath the surface. Lucas's fingers hovered over the relic again, the stone cold beneath his touch. His mind had begun to wander, exploring deeper layers within the artifact, trying to push beyond its dormant state. He felt a strange compulsion to understand it, to unlock the mysteries that surrounded the relics, and by extension the strange connection they shared with him, Mina, and Thomas. There was something urgent about this, something that whispered at the edges of his thoughts. The network of alien neural energy was still there, tangled and obscure, but Lucas had begun to untangle its threads. The faintest flicker of something like awareness ran through the relic's dormant structure, and he pressed on, drawing closer to its depths. It felt almost like the relic was coming alive under his touch, as if he were peeling back the layers of a complex puzzle, each layer revealing a hidden truth about the ancient origins of the artifacts. But then, without warning, the atmosphere in the lab shifted, the air thickened, and a static hum began to pulse from the relic. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. A surge of energy shot through his arm, and his skin prickled with an intense heat. The relic, once still and silent, began to glow faintly at first, then more brightly, pulsing with an ominous red hue. The sensation was sharp, like an electric current running through his veins, and his heart began to race. The lights in the lab flickered violently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Lucas blinked in confusion, his focus momentarily broken as the once sterile atmosphere around him became charged with energy. The hum grew louder, an underlying sound that seemed to reverberate not just in the room, but in his very mind. Intrusion detected. The words were not spoken, not out loud, but within his mind, deep in the core of his thoughts, as though the relic was reaching into his consciousness and issuing a warning. His body tensed instinctively, the strange sense of urgency rising like a tide. He pulled back, instinctively trying to distance himself from the relic, but his wrist refused to obey. The relic was stuck there, firmly adhered to his skin. It would not come off. He was trapped. Safety processes engaged. The message flashed again, more insistent this time, cold warning that sent a shiver down his spine. Lucas's mind raced as the room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as if the relic's energy had shifted the very space around him. It was as though the relic had become aware of his intrusion, aware of him, and possibly of his intentions. Suddenly, a sharp crackle of static echoed in the air, and the environment seemed to shimmer, as if being analyzed or scanned. His heartbeat accelerated, the sounds of the lab growing distorted, the lights flickering erratically as if in response to the growing energy surging from the relic. The feeling of being scrutinized became overwhelming, as though the relic was mapping every part of his body, every breath he took, every movement he made. He could almost feel invisible tendrils of energy probing him, scanning, searching. Full scan of the environment and wearer. Lucas's mind snapped to attention. The relic was not just scanning the lab, it was scanning him too. His own body, his own DNA. He could feel the ripples of energy seeping into his being, brushing against the edges of his consciousness. There was no escaping the sensation. The relic was dissecting him, his biology, his mind, his very essence, like a living intelligence unraveling his identity. Mismatch DNA detected. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The relic recognized something, some discrepancy. Something about him, something about his DNA, didn't match what it expected. The realization hit him hard. The relics didn't fully recognize him, or any of them. The mismatch felt like a fracture in the fabric of his existence. He was not of the same kind as the relic expected, perhaps because of their ancient origins, perhaps because they were bound to him and not to the people they were intended for. He didn't belong. A cold shiver ran through his entire being as the realization set in. The relics were alien, far beyond anything humanity had ever conceived of, possibly from an entirely different era or dimension. And now, as they tested his genetic makeup, as they tried to understand him, he could feel the tension rising. The relics did not recognize him as one of their own. This mismatch, this break in what was expected, had triggered a defense mechanism, a response designed to protect the relics from unknown or potentially dangerous variables. The energy from the relic surged again, hotter this time, burning through his wrist. He winced in pain, but it wasn't just physical. It was as if the relic were reaching inside him, probing deeper into his thoughts, into his very essence. He couldn't shake the sense that the relic's power was growing in ways he couldn't understand, ways that scared him. If the relics were capable of this kind of defensive reaction, what would they do if they fully activated? What kind of power were they hiding? Dormant mode initiated. The final message hit him like a weight, its finality heavy and stark. The red glow from the relic began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic pattern, fading away, sinking back into the stone. The warmth that had been radiating from the relic receded as well, leaving Lucas's wrist feeling cold and lifeless once more. It was as though the relic had retreated, going back into its slumber. The tension that had filled the air was gone, leaving behind an unsettling silence. But even in that silence, Lucas knew the danger was not over. The relic had not fully awakened. Not yet. He took a shaky breath, his body still tense with adrenaline. The scan had ceased, and the immediate threat seemed to dissipate, but his heart pounded in his chest. The relic had reacted. It had been triggered by something he had done, something he had unintentionally caused by pushing too far into its depths. He could still feel the remnants of its power, like a faint hum against his skin. The dormant mode had only been temporary. He could sense the relic's energy, quiet but ever-present beneath the surface, waiting for another attempt, another movement. Lucas withdrew from the relic, though he felt a sense of urgency gnawing at him. He needed to understand it. He needed to find out what it was, what it could do. But now he was painfully aware of how little he knew. The relic was dangerous, and it had shown him just how dangerous it could be. It was not a simple artifact. It was a sentient piece of technology, one that held power beyond comprehension. For now, he would need to retreat, to gather his thoughts, and to prepare for whatever came next. But there was no doubt in his mind. The relics were more than just tools. They were keys. And if he wasn't careful, They could unlock something far worse than anything he could anticipate. Lucas stared at the data console, his mind whirring with new revelations. The lab around him was quiet, save for the low hum of equipment and the flickering lights above. He had been investigating the relics for hours now, analyzing the data he had painstakingly gathered from every angle. It was a lot to process, but the more he looked at the numbers and the results of his blood tests, the clearer the picture became. The relics, dormant and powerful, had been waiting for something, for the right conditions to activate fully. But the more Lucas examined the intricacies of their technology, the more questions arose. These weren't just magical artifacts or ancient relics imbued with mystical energy. They were remnants of a far more advanced and forgotten civilization. They were technological marvels, and Lucas had barely scratched the surface of their true capabilities. When the relics had first activated their defensive systems, the one thing that had stood out was the DNA mismatch. It had been a surprise, triggering the relic's alarm system and nearly sparking a catastrophic event. But after conducting his tests and analyzing the results, Lucas found that the mismatch wasn't nearly as significant as he had feared. The discrepancy was almost negligible, less than 0.001%. It was so small that it could be compared to the genetic difference between identical twins. Still, the relics had reacted as if this small variation was something to be wary of. Lucas rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it. It made him uneasy. Why had the relics responded so strongly to something so insignificant? Why had their recognition algorithms glitched, especially when the mismatch was so tiny? It wasn't as though they had never encountered genetic differences before. Surely the relic's creators would have accounted for variations in DNA. As he pondered this, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about the relics. Something about their connection to him and the others. He glanced down at his wrist where the relic was still attached. The cold metal of the artifact hummed faintly, its pulse steady, but there was no sense of danger anymore. Yet, the mystery had only deepened. The more Lucas thought about it, the more he began to realize that the relics weren't responding to them as chosen ones. They weren't waiting for the sent ones or some destined saviors to appear. The relics were designed for specific individuals, people whose genetic makeup would align perfectly with the relic's ancient technology. And in their case, there was a mismatch, however small. What if they weren't the ones the relics had been waiting for? What if they weren't the true chosen ones after all? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling him in a way that made his stomach churn. He had always believed that his connection to the relics was a sign that he was part of something bigger, something destined. The relic's presence on his wrist had been a constant reminder of the prophecy, the potential power, and the responsibility that came with it. But now, as he considered the facts, he couldn't ignore the possibility that they had been wrong all along. What if the relics were merely responding to him because they had no other choice? What if the prophecy had misled them, or worse? What if the relics were not even supposed to be activated by people like him? The idea unsettled him further. Was it possible that the relic's dormant state was a result of their waiting for the right conditions, conditions that simply hadn't been met yet? Or had they been waiting for someone who wasn't them? His mind raced through every detail he had uncovered about the relics so far, seeking an answer, but each new piece of information only seemed to lead to more questions. Could this all just be some twisted mistake? He muttered under his breath. The more he considered it, the more Lucas felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. The relics were supposed to be the key, the power that would change the course of events. But if they weren't meant for him, if the prophecy had been wrong, or even manipulated, what would that mean for the upcoming war? For Mina and Thomas? For the future of the Sent Ones? His thoughts flickered back to the faint connection he had felt with the relics when they first activated, and the strange way the relics seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. That connection had felt real, undeniable, but it also felt like a thread tugging at him from some distant, unknowable place. Perhaps the relics had been dormant for so long that they had lost the ability to recognize the true people they were meant for. Perhaps it wasn't even about them anymore. Maybe they were only waiting for something far greater, something that he couldn't yet comprehend. Lucas clenched his fists, trying to steady his thoughts. He couldn't let himself be consumed by doubt. Whatever the relics were, whatever they represented, he had to continue. They were tied to the prophecy, and whether or not he was the true chosen one, he had a role to play. The war was coming, and they needed every advantage they could get. If the relics held the key to defeating the Empire, then he had to understand them, no matter how unsettling the truth might be. The truth might not be as clear-cut as he had hoped, but he couldn't afford to stop now. He couldn't let the relic's secret slip through his fingers. There was too much at stake. The knowledge they contained could change everything, even if that meant stepping into a role he hadn't yet fully accepted. As the weight of these thoughts settled into him, Lucas felt the faintest stir from the relic on his wrist. The pulse had become stronger, more insistent, as if the relic had sensed his resolve. He knew now that it wasn't going to be easy to unlock their potential. The relics were ancient, and their technology was far beyond anything he had encountered before. But he also knew that they held power that could shape the future. With a deep breath, Lucas set his mind to work. There was no time for doubt. There was no time for second-guessing. The relics had a purpose, and so did he. Whether he was truly the chosen one or not, the path forward was clear. He would uncover their secrets, and in doing so discover what role he was truly meant to play in this unfolding conflict. The relics, dormant as they were, had already begun to stir. And Lucas had no choice but to follow wherever they would lead.